Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia Meier and I'm one of the co-founders of the Rogue Theater here in Tucson, Arizona. The Rogue's Theater mission is to produce great works of literature with challenging ideas. We are in our 16th season at the Rogue and still going strong. We are making our way through the pandemic by offering socially distanced, masked live performances as well as professionally produced video productions. We are currently in the process of rehearsing and staging Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which opens November 5th and runs through November 22nd. It is my great pleasure to share with you some of the history and ideas embodied in that iconic story. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. So begins Chapter 4 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley was born August 30th, 1797, in Somerstown, London, which was at that time just to the northwest of London. Mary Shelley would go on to write one of the first instances of science fiction and one of the most enduring books of the Western canon, Frankenstein. She wrote Frankenstein at the tender age of 18. Who was Mary Shelley? What caused her to write such an extraordinary novel? And how has the myth she created gone on to live in our imaginations throughout the 200 years since it was written? Mary Shelley was the daughter of two radical intellectuals. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a philosopher and early advocate for women's rights. Most notably, she wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. In this treatise, she argues that women are intellectually equal to men, but lack the educational opportunities that men have. Yes, she wrote this in 1792. Mary Shelley's mother developed ideas that would inform much of later feminist thought. Mary Shelley's father was William Godwin, also a philosopher, most noted for writing an inquiry concerning political justice. William Godwin was one of the first proponents of anarchism. Mary Wollstonecraft met William Godwin after she had had a child by another man. That child, Fanny, would grow up in the Godwin household as the older sister of Mary Shelley. So, Mary Shelley's parents were a feminist and an anarchist. They were forward-thinking people who lived their lives with passion and little regard for social norms. Mary's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died just 11 days after Mary was born. Broken-hearted, William Godwin was left with a young daughter, Fanny, and baby Mary, both of whom he raised with help from friends and relatives. After his wife's death, Godwin wrote a memoir about Mary Wollstonecraft, and he raised a monument to her in St. Pancras Churchyard in London. A tombstone that would help little Mary learn to read by tracing the engraved letters with her fingers on the tombstone over and over again. Also at this same tombstone, which Mary often returned to, Mary would declare her love to the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley some 16 years later. It is suggested in one of Percy's poems that he and Mary also made love for the first time on her mother's grave. In Godwin's memoir of Mary Wollstonecraft, he describes his wife's intelligence. The strength of her mind lay in intuition. This is a portrait of the romantic ideal, where intuition, led by perception and feeling, is seen to be superior to the structures of logic and reasoning. This capital R romantic ideal will also inform Mary Shelley's thinking later in life. When Mary was 4 years old, her father remarried. Mary's stepmother, with whom Mary shared little affinity, was Mary Jane Clairmont. This new mother brought her own young children, Claire and Charles, from 2 different previous relationships into the family. Little Claire was the same age as Mary, and they became fast companions. In a few short years, Godwin and his new wife would have a son together, William, to add to the family. Mary's father, William Godwin, was now responsible for a family of 5 children, none of whom had the same 2 parents. So, Mary Shelley's childhood family was stitched together in various non-traditional ways. She was also raised in a stimulating atmosphere of her father's many intellectual friends. Frequent dinner guests included the revolutionary Thomas Paine, the research chemist Sir Humphrey Davy, the Quaker social reformer Robert Owen, and the romantic poets William Blake, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, and many others who were considered to be on the leading edge of contemporary thought. In addition to the excitement of intellectual conversation surrounding young Mary, when she was 8 years old, her father and his wife set up a bookshop and publishing house. Mary had full access to all of the books in the shop, and she read voraciously. Although she never attended formal school, she had much of Western literature and thought at her fingertips, both in books and in person. This is how Mary Shelley spent much of her adolescence. She is described by others as not only extremely intelligent, but also beautiful. And it is both of these qualities which attracted the poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. When he meets Mary, it is for the first time at her father's house. Much later he would write, "O Mary dear, that you were here, with your brown eyes bright and clear, and your sweet voice like a bird, singing love to its lone mate in the ivy bower disconsolate. Voice the sweetest ever heard, and your brow more than the sky of this azure Italy. Mary dear, come to me soon. I am not well whilst thou art far. As sunset to the sphered moon, as twilight to the western star, thou beloved art to me. O Mary dear, that you were here. The castle echo whispers here." Percy Bysshe Shelley was not only a promising young poet, but he was also heir to a baronetcy, and he was also married, the father of 1 child with another on the way when he met Mary Godwin. He was 21 and Mary was 16. The attraction was mutual, and in 1814 they ran away together to France, taking Mary's stepsister, Claire, along with them. Now, the relationship with Claire was complicated. While she had been Mary's closest confidant through their childhood, Claire became something of a competitor for Percy's affections. While Mary was pregnant, Percy took to spending time out and about with Claire. Percy was always clear that his relationship with Mary was not exclusive, and in fact, he encouraged Mary to pursue her own affairs, even suggesting his friend, the barrister Thomas Hogg, as a potential lover. But Mary remained devoted to Percy throughout her life, and long after his death from a boating accident at the age of 30. In fact, Mary's son finds Percy's actual desiccated heart wrapped in paper in Mary's desk after she dies. Another somewhat gruesome fact that reminds us that Mary Shelley is indeed the author of Frankenstein. For several months, the threesome of Mary, Percy, and Claire traveled about Europe, staying in cheap places and dirty hotels. Percy may have been an heir to a baronetcy, but he would not have access to his father's fortune until after his father's death. Mary became pregnant on the 3-month trip, and when they completely ran out of money, they returned to England. Mary would later give birth to a child who dies shortly after she is born. In England, Mary and Percy are shunned, including by Mary's father. Percy is still married to his wife, Harriet, although he takes up residence with Mary, and he and Mary have another child, William. In 1816, Mary, Percy, and Sister Claire travel again to Europe, this time to Switzerland to meet the Bohemian poet, Lord Byron. Byron is wealthy, sexually ambiguous, and at the height of his poetic capabilities. He had just written the first 2 cantos of his great poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Claire develops a relationship with Byron, and in fact bears his child. But what is most interesting to us is that this is where the seeds of Mary's great novel Frankenstein are sown. Lord Byron is staying at Villa Diodati in Geneva with his companion and personal doctor, John William Polidori. Polidori will later write one of the very first vampire stories before he commits suicide at the age of 25. The 5 young people, Mary, Percy, Claire, Byron, and Dr. Polidori, are inseparable for the summer. This summer is in a year, by the way, that is notoriously referred to as the year without a summer. Mount Tambora in Indonesia had erupted and filled the atmosphere with so much volcanic ash that it blocked out the sun and created a volcanic winter. The 5 young people spend what days they can boating on Lake Geneva, and they spend their evenings drinking wine and probably taking laudanum, a type of opium, and talking about poetry and philosophy. Mary writes to her stepsister Fanny on June 1st of that summer. An almost perpetual rain confines us principally to the house. The thunderstorms that visit us are grander and more terrific than I have ever seen before. One night we enjoyed a finer storm than I have ever beheld. The lake was lit up, the pines on Jura made visible, and all the scene illuminated for an instant, while a pitchy blackness succeeded, and thunder came in frightful bursts over our heads amid the blackness. One can almost see the creation of Frankenstein's monster with his electrostatic beginnings in this passage of Mary's letter. It is on one of those stormy evenings that Lord Byron suggests a competition among the 5 of them of who can tell the best ghost story. And with this suggestion, Mary Shelley begins to develop the story for which she will always be known. During this summer, Mary also discovers the Mer de Glace, a glacier on the northern slopes of Mont Blanc in the French Alps, a world of ice, as Mary describes it. The most desolate place in the world. Iced mountains surround it. No sign of vegetation appears except on the place from which you view the scene. It is across this glacier that the creature approaches Victor Frankenstein to beg for a companion. Victor Frankenstein narrates, "I remain in a recess of the rock, gazing on this wonderful and stupendous scene. The sea, or rather the vast river of ice, wound among its dependent mountains whose aerial summits hung over its recesses. Their icy and glittering peaks shone in the sunlight over the clouds. My heart, which was before sorrowful, now swelled with something like joy. I suddenly beheld the figure of a man at some distance, advancing towards me with superhuman speed." When Mary and Percy and Claire return again to England, Claire will have her baby, Percy's wife will commit suicide, as will Mary's older stepsister Fanny. Percy and Mary will finally marry, and Mary will become pregnant again. And Mary will continue to write her book full of death and birth. At this time, Mary became interested in experimental science and attended lectures at the Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. Galvanism was popular in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The science is named after the scientist Luigi Galvani, who discovered the effects of electricity on muscle tissue when investigating an unrelated phenomenon which required skinned frogs in the 1780s. His assistant is claimed to have accidentally touched a scalpel to the sciatic nerve of the frog, and this resulted in a spark and animation of the legs. This knowledge, of course, came in handy in developing the story of Frankenstein and his reanimated creature. Another development of the time that made its way into Frankenstein is the surge of interest in polar exploration. In 1819, Sir William Edmund Perry, who would eventually set a long-standing record for human exploration farthest north, made his way halfway across the Arctic above Canada. His expedition excited much interest in England, and Mary Shelley read of his journey. Frankenstein begins and ends in the Arctic, with much of the story told to the polar explorer Robert Walton. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is in fact an assemblage of various source materials and influences. Certainly, she included significant material from her own life. Elizabeth, the novel's heroine, was the name of Percy's mother. Victor, the name of Dr. Frankenstein, was a name that Percy adopted for himself as a young boy. And William, the child who dies at the hands of the creature, was the name of Mary's father, her stepbrother, and her son. In the novel, Elizabeth's stepmother dies, leaving Elizabeth bereft, much as Mary is bereft by never having known her own mother. Mary's interest in the reanimation of dead tissue is reflected in a dream she describes in her journal in 1816. In the dream, she attempts to bring her dead child alive by rubbing him with flames. Another possible influence that turned her mind toward monsters were Mary's parents and their characterization by various critics. Her mother and father's innovative thought and writings were characterized as monstrous by more than one traditional thinker. And Mary, throughout her life, came to sympathize with outcasts and outsiders, hence her sympathy with the creature Frankenstein creates. All of these ideas and experiences find their way into Frankenstein. Her literary influences were many. On the title page of her novel, we see two significant ones. Frankenstein is subtitled A Modern Prometheus, and she, like many of the Romantic-era poets, was taken with the Greek myth of Prometheus. The trickster Prometheus created humans from clay and was punished by the gods for giving fire to humankind. Zeus punishes Prometheus by chaining him to a rock. Each day an eagle descends to peck out his liver from his body, and each night the liver grows back and the torture begins anew the next day. Yes, Prometheus was a favorite myth of the Romantic poets. Lord Byron wrote a poem called Prometheus, and one of Percy Bysshe Shelley's most famous lyrical dramas, written around the time of Frankenstein, is called Prometheus Unbound. Here's a stanza from that poem. Life may vanish, but it may fly not. Hope may vanish, but can die not. Truth be veiled, but still it burneth. Love repulse, but it returneth. Another significant literary influence for Mary Shelley was the great poet John Milton. On the title page of Frankenstein is an epigraph by John Milton from Paradise Lost. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? These lines are spoken in Paradise Lost by Adam after the fall. Mary Shelley sees her creature as Adam, and her protagonist, Victor Frankenstein, as a kind of Prometheus. Throughout the novel, she returns to Milton's themes from Paradise Lost. In 1818, when Mary Shelley is 20, Frankenstein is published anonymously. Many people believed that Percy had actually written the novel. Percy did, in fact, offer suggestions and emendations to the manuscript of the novel before it was published. But his changes may have made the novel less powerful. Researcher Anne Mellor shows how some of the differences between Mary's original writing and Percy's revision. Where Mary wrote have, Percy changed it to possess. When Mary wrote took away, Percy changed it to extinguish. Where Mary wrote we were all equal, Percy changed it to neither of us possessed the slightest preeminence over the other. And do not wish to hate you became will not be tempted to set myself in opposition to thee. And it was a long time became a considerable period elapsed. Percy eliminated many more of Mary's more colloquial phrases and inserted his more learned polysyllabic terms. I, for one, like Mary's more direct choice of words. At any rate, at the time, no one believed the novel could have been written by a woman. A second and heavily revised edition of the novel was published in 1831, with Mary Shelley identified as its author. This edition was published by William Godwin, her father, with a memorable frontispiece, portraying the scientist Victor Frankenstein with his creature. Upon the original publication, the book received a few mixed reviews. Some were glowing, including one by Sir Walter Scott, who wrote, "Upon the whole, the work impresses us with a high idea of the author's original genius and happy power of expression." Others were less positive, including the Edinburgh magazine, which wrote, "Here is one of the productions of the modern school in its highest style of caricature and exaggeration." After its publication, the novel disappeared into temporary obscurity, and fewer than 500 copies were sold of the first edition. But it was made famous in the 1820s by no less than 5 adaptations for the stage. In the first production in London, the creature was portrayed by the actor T.P. Cook. The role made him famous, much as it would make Boris Karloff famous over 100 years later. Although the adaptation made several changes from the novel without consulting Mary Shelley, and although she received no compensation for the adaptation, she went to the theater in 1823 to see it. But lo and behold, I found myself famous. Frankenstein had prodigious success as a drama at the English Opera House. Mr. Cook played the creature's part extremely well, his trying to grasp at the sounds he heard. All he does was well imagined and executed. It appears to excite a breathless eagerness in the audience. In the early performances, all the ladies fainted and hubbub ensued. They continue to play it even now. The changes from the novel made in this production seem to inform all future productions. The delicate moral themes of the novel were lost, and the tone shifted to melodrama and farce. Victor Frankenstein became a mad scientist instead of the romantic and idealistic figure in the novel. His laboratory was the focus, with its electrical generators and steaming vats, while in the novel, Frankenstein works at a simple table by candlelight. And in the novel, there is no assistant named Fritz, nor Igor, nor Igor. And perhaps most significantly, the creature is reduced to saying almost nothing. While in the novel, he is the most eloquent of all the characters. In chapter 13, the creature speaks, "And what was I? Of my creation and my creator, I was absolutely ignorant. Where were my friends and relations? No father had watched my infant days, no mother had blessed me with smiles and caresses, or if they had, all my past life was now a blot, a blind vacancy in which I distinguished nothing. I was, besides, endued with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature as man. When I looked around, I saw and heard no one like me. Was I, then, a monster? a blot upon the earth from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? I cannot describe the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. Oh, that I had forever remained in my native wood, nor known nor felt beyond the sensations of hunger, thirst, and heat. Mary Shelley lived 30 years beyond Percy Bysshe Shelley. She would go on to edit and preserve her husband's poetry, and she would write several more novels of her own, also biographical articles and a travel book. Perhaps one of her most interesting novels is a book called The Last Man. The novel, written 8 years after Frankenstein, is another book of science fiction which this time takes place in England in the 21st century. England is a republic governed by a ruling elite. An outsider named Lionel Verney narrates a story of tragic love. Percy had drowned 4 years earlier. The action takes place during a global pandemic, a reemergence of the bubonic plague, which nearly eliminates humankind. A global pandemic in the 21st century in a country ruled by an elite class. What an imagination Mary Shelley had. The Last Man begins with another Milton epigram. Let no man speak henceforth to be foretold what shall befall him or his children. Milton was still an inspiration for Mary Shelley. In Paradise Lost, this is a plea from Adam to the archangel Michael after the angel has shown him the destruction from the great flood. The legend of Frankenstein lives long beyond Mary Shelley's death in 1851. By the middle of the 19th century, the name Frankenstein had become a code word for misguided ambition. The Victorians took up the idea of Frankenstein as mistaken idealism. Cartoonists in the late 19th century seized on the Frankenstein image as a good idea gone wrong. In America, political cartoonists took up the image of Frankenstein as a monster of European imperialism coming across the Atlantic to American shores. Eventually, the term Frankenstein came to mean anything that had been stitched together to create a monster. In many ways, the stage may be responsible for the enduring image of Frankenstein. In addition to the production at the English Opera House, which Mary Shelley saw, between 1823 and 1931, 26 different Frankenstein plays were produced. But nowhere is the indelible image of Frankenstein more vivid to Americans than in the 1931 horror film starring Boris Karloff and directed by John Whale. The film begins with Edward Van Sloan stepping from behind a curtain to deliver a brief caution to his audience. We are about to unfold the story of Frankenstein, a man of science who sought to create a man after his own image without reckoning upon God. It is one of the strangest tales ever told. It deals with two great mysteries of creation, life and death. I think it will thrill you. It may shock you. It may even horrify you. So if any of you feel that you do not care to subject your nerves to such a strain, now is your chance to, well, we warned you. This introduction sets the scene for the beginning of the horror film genre, as well as remind us of Rod Serling's introduction to the Twilight Zone in 1959. The film would popularize the image of the inarticulate monster, as well as the mad scientist and his hunchbacked assistants, none of which was in the original novel. Its campy scene in which the hand of the monster is first animated by lightning, accompanied by the ravings of Frankenstein, "It's alive, it's alive, it's alive," and so on, he says that 9 times, will be caricatured in various forms for decades. The 1931 film would be the first of a series of 8 Frankenstein-themed movies by Universal Studios in the 30s and 40s. It would propel Boris Karloff to stardom and create a whole subgenre of horror movies, many of which cast Karloff as various monsters, the Mummy, the Ghoul, and the Walking Dead, among others. But the 1931 film was not the first Frankenstein film. In fact, that film was a remake of 3 silent movies which preceded it. Then, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, England would pick up the Frankenstein banner and produce 7 more films, including Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Further spoofs and adaptations and comics would ensue, which owe much to Mary Shelley's creation, including the 60s television series The Munsters, the 70s Rocky Horror Picture Show, and even the 80s Blade Runner. Not to mention Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein, starring Gene Wilder and Peter Boyle, a hysterical reinterpretation of the 1931 film. More recent iterations include the recently streamed 2011 National Theatre production starring Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller, in which the actors alternated the roles of Victor Frankenstein and the creature each night. And political cartoonists today still find ways to use the image of Frankenstein. At The Rogue, we have embarked on our own telling of Frankenstein, authored by David Catlin. Catlin is a founding ensemble member of the Looking Glass Theater in Chicago. Catlin beautifully marries the Frankenstein story with the real-life story of Mary Shelley to create Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. What emerges is a fascinating portrait of Mary and Percy Shelley, woven through the life of Victor Frankenstein and his monster. One of my favorite lines in our production is near the end of the play, when Mary Shelley tells Percy, "Are there not monsters in each of us? Monsters born of our despair and loneliness?" This line speaks to the connection that Mary Shelley feels with her creation. We are immensely enjoying exploring both the worlds of the novel and the novelist, and we look forward to sharing them with you. You can see the play either in person here at the Rogue or through our professional video recording of the play for those of you who feel more comfortable staying at home. So, what is it that Frankenstein still has to say to us? Nearly 200 years after his inception? Perhaps Frankenstein's monster lets us explore the anxieties we have about our own human nature, as well as our most constant companion, death. That story will never get old. Thank you.